The glass door of the brand-new Agri-King dealership hissed shut behind Jedediah Stone, muffling the drone of highway traffic and replacing it with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights. The air inside was cool and smelled of plastic and fresh paint. A clean, chemical scent so different from the honest aromas of diesel, grease, and turned earth that clung to his overalls. On the polished concrete floor, behemoths of green and red and orange steel sat like pagan gods under the bright lights. A John Deere 4840, its tires taller than a man, gleamed next to an International Harvester 1586, its stark white cab and bold red chassis looking more like a spaceship than a tractor. Jed felt a dozen eyes on him, or maybe he just felt his own dirtiness in this pristine temple of modern agriculture. His overalls worn soft as flannel in the knees and stained with the ghosts of 50 seasons of hydraulic fluid and engine oil, were a stark contrast to the crisp polyester suits of the salesman. His boots, caked with the dark, rich soil of his own land, left faint, dusty footprints on the showroom floor. He clutched a small, greasy metal part in his calloused hand, the reason for his pilgrimage to this place he so despised. Across the showroom, the dealership owner, Richard Vance, was holding court. Rich was young, with a smile full of teeth that never quite reached his eyes, and hair that was sprayed into a perfect, immovable helmet. He was leaning against the front tire of the 1586, laughing with Frank Miller. Frank was everything Jed was not. Frank farmed 6 sections, all of it mortgaged to the hilt. He traded his combines every 2 years, and his main tractors every 3, always chasing the newest, biggest, and most powerful machine the bank would let him buy. Frank, with this new axial flow combine and that 1586, you'll be done with harvest before old Jed Stone even gets his binder out of the shed, Rich said, his voice carrying across the showroom. Frank let out a booming laugh. Jed? Hell, Rich, his old 4020 probably thinks Turbo is a brand of chewing tobacco. I swear that man farms like it's still 1955. It's a wonder he makes a crop at all. Jed ignored them. He'd been hearing talk like that for 20 years. It was background noise, like the cawing of crows in the morning. He walked past the gleaming new machines, his eyes scanning for the parts counter at the back. He ran a hand over the fender of a new John Deere 2640, a utility tractor that was still bigger than the Farmall M his father had bought brand new after the war. The paint was slick and perfect, without a single scratch or patch of rust. It felt alien to him, like a toy. His machines had stories etched into their steel, the dent on the 4020's hood from a fallen oak limb in '68, the weld on the Farmall's drawbar from when he'd tried to pull a stump too big for it. These new tractors had no stories, they only had payment books. He reached the parts counter, where an older man named Earl was squinting at a microfiche reader. Earl had been a mechanic for 40 years before they put him behind the counter. He knew tractors inside and out, not from a sales brochure, but from busted knuckles and long nights under floodlights. "Afternoon, Jed," Earl said, looking up over his spectacles. "Don't tell me that old dear of yours finally gave up the ghost." "Not yet, Earl. She's just got a little cough," Jed replied, placing the worn-out hydraulic fitting on the counter. "Pump seal's weeping. Figured I'd rebuild the whole thing while I got it apart. Need a full seal and gasket kit for a 66 power shift." Earl nodded, taking the fitting. "They don't make 'em like that anymore. That old 8-speed power shift is a work of art. Simple, tough. These new ones," he gestured out at the showroom floor, "computer chips and more wiring than a telephone exchange. A man can't even fix his own equipment anymore." As Earl shuffled to the back to find the parts, Rich Vance and Frank Miller ambled over, their conversation continuing. "The real prize is the old McGregor place," Rich was saying, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Full section of the best black dirt in the county, coming up for auction next month." "I'll be there." Frank puffed out his chest. "The bank's already approved the line of credit. With that ground and the new equipment, I'll be the biggest operator in 3 counties. Rich finally deigned to notice Jed standing at the counter. He gave Jed's overalls a dismissive up-and-down glance, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Jedediah, looking for a part for one of your antiques? You know, for what you'll spend patching that old junk together this year, you could make the down payment on a brand new 444 0% financing for the first year. Think of the time you'd save. No more breakdowns in the middle of planting." "My 40/20 is paid for," Jed said, his voice quiet but steady as a rock. "Been paid for since 1971. How long is the payment book on that one?" He nodded toward the massive 4840. Rich's smile tightened. "It's not about being paid for, Jed. It's about efficiency, leverage, using the bank's money to make more money. It's the modern way. You can't get ahead with a 30-acre mindset in a 3,000-acre world." "I sleep at night," Jed said simply. Earl returned with a small cardboard box and a few gaskets in a plastic sleeve. "Here you go, Jed. $94.52. Jed pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and counted out the cash in crisp $10 and $20 bills. He never used credit. If he couldn't pay cash, he didn't need it. As he pocketed his change, he heard Frank Miller chuckle. "Sleep at night? I'll sleep just fine on the pile of money I'm going to make off the McGregor place. You ought to come to the auction, Jed. Be good for a laugh, watching real farmers do business." Jed picked up his box of parts. He looked at Frank, then at Rich. He didn't say a word. He just held their gaze for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, just a deep, quiet appraisal, the way a man looks at a cloudy sky to judge the coming storm. He turned and walked toward the door, his dusty boot prints a trail leading away from the gleaming, debt-fueled machines. He paused with his hand on the door, listening to their laughter behind him, the sound echoing off the polished floor. "Now, before we go any further, and before I tell you what was going through Jedediah Stone's mind as he stood there, holding that $95 box of parts that was the key to keeping his old world turning, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been looked down on, been judged by the dirt on your hands or the wear on your clothes? Have you ever had someone with a fancy suit and a slick smile dismiss you because they thought they knew your worth just by looking at you? Let me know your story down in the comments, because that feeling of being underestimated, that's the slow-burning, high-octane fuel that powers this whole story. Jed pushed the door open and stepped back out into the humid afternoon air. The clean, artificial smell of the dealership was replaced by the familiar scent of hot asphalt and distant alfalfa fields. The world outside felt real again. He didn't get angry. Anger was a wasted motion, an emotion that burned fuel and produced no horsepower. What he felt was a cold, hard certainty, a resolve that settled deep in his bones. Frank and Rich saw an old man in dirty overalls. They saw a relic. They didn't see the 53 consecutive harvests he'd brought in. They didn't see the paid-off deeds in the lockbox at home. They didn't see the columns of figures he kept in a ledger book, tracking every penny earned and saved for 40 years. They saw a museum piece. They had no idea the museum was about to make a new acquisition. Back in the sanctuary of his own machine shed, the world made sense again. The air was thick with the smells of his life, the metallic tang of penetrating oil, the sweetness of old gasoline, the earthy scent of mud-caked tires. His tools hung in their proper places on the pegboard walls, a testament to a lifetime of order and repair. His workshop wasn't clean, but it was organized. Every wrench, every socket, every drift pin had a home. He set the box from the dealership on his workbench, a massive thing he'd built himself from 2-inch oak planks laid over a welded steel frame. He cracked open a bottle of RC Cola and took a long drink, the cold sweetness cutting through the dust in his throat. Then he turned his attention to the John Deere 40-20. It sat in the center of the bay, its patient green silhouette illuminated by the afternoon sun slanting through the open doors. To Frank Miller, it was junk. To Jed, it was family. He knew every inch of it. He knew the precise spot on the clutch pedal where it engaged, the particular growl the diesel engine made when it was pulling a heavy load in 6th gear, the way the power shift lever clicked solidly into place. He'd bought it used in '66, a 2-year-old tractor with barely 500 hours on it. He'd paid it off in 5 years, and for the 13 years since, every hour it worked was pure profit. The hydraulic pump was buried deep in its guts, a complicated piece of machinery that was the heart of the tractor's power steering, brakes, and 3-point hitch. To a modern dealership mechanic, it was a sealed unit you replaced. To Jed, it was a puzzle to be solved. For the next 3 days, the machine shed became his world. He started by draining the 20 gallons of high-guard transmission and hydraulic fluid, the amber liquid smelling faintly burnt, a sign the pump was indeed failing. He disconnected the heavy steel lines, carefully labeling each one with a piece of masking tape. He unbolted the pump housing, a cast-iron beast that weighed nearly 100 pounds. Using his engine hoist, he carefully lifted it from the tractor's transmission case and swung it onto his workbench. The work was slow and meticulous. He scrubbed decades of caked-on grease from the housing with a wire brush and a can of solvent. He laid out a clean canvas tarp on the bench and began the disassembly. He used snap ring pliers to remove the retaining clips, a brass drift, and a small hammer to gently tap out the bearing races. Inside, the pump was a marvel of mid-century engineering, a series of pistons and swash plates, all machined to tolerances of less than 1/1000th of an inch. He found the culprit, just as he'd suspected. A tiny O-ring on the main pressure piston had become brittle with age and heat, cracking and allowing high-pressure fluid to leak past. It was a $2 part that had crippled a $10,000 tractor. He carefully cleaned every component, inspecting each piston and cylinder wall for scoring, measuring the clearances with a feeler gauge. He replaced every single seal and gasket from the kit Earl had sold him, coating each one with a thin film of fresh hydraulic fluid before assembly. The reassembly was the reverse of the teardown, but it required even more care. He torqued every bolt to the exact specification listed in his worn, grease-stained service manual. He reinstalled the pump, reconnected the lines, and filled the system with fresh high guard, pouring it through a funnel with a fine mesh screen to catch any possible contaminants. By the 3rd evening, it was done. With his wife, Martha, watching from the doorway of the shed, he climbed into the familiar worn seat. He turned the key. The starter groaned for a moment. Then the big 6-cylinder diesel engine roared to life, settling into a smooth, confident idle. He let it warm up, his eyes scanning the gauges. Oil pressure? Good. Temperature climbing slowly. He worked the hydraulic levers. The 3-point hitch arms rose smoothly and powerfully. He turned the steering wheel from lock to lock. It moved with silent, effortless grace. The leak was gone. The heart of his old iron horse was beating strong again. He'd saved himself a $2,000 repair bill from the dealer, and more importantly, he'd done it himself. A few weeks later, Jed was at the grain co-op, waiting to unload his first truckload of soybeans. The air was buzzing with the talk of high prices and the upcoming McGregor auction. Frank Miller was there, of course, leaning against his new Ford pickup, a shiny F-250 that still had the dealer plates on it. "Heard you were playing mechanic again, Jed," Frank called out, a smug grin on his face. "You ever figure if you paid yourself a wage for all those hours you spend fixing that junk, you'd be better off just buying new?" "Some things aren't about wages, Frank," Jed said, checking the tension on the tarp strap of his old Chevy C60 grain truck. "You say that now," Frank said, gesturing with his thumb toward the co-op's bulletin board, where the auction notice was posted. "But when I'm farming another 640 acres of prime bottomland next spring, and you're still trying to get that old planter to drop seed straight, you might change your tune. You're getting left behind, old man. This is the big time now." The other farmers standing around chuckled. They all looked up to Frank. He was the one who was winning, the one who was embracing the future. Jed was a curiosity, a stubborn old mule ploughing a crooked furrow, while everyone else was driving straight with GPS. They saw his debt-free farm not as a sign of wisdom, but as a sign of small thinking. They saw his saved money as a pile of missed opportunities. They didn't understand that Jed wasn't playing their game. He was playing a different one, a longer one, and he was the only one who knew the rules. The late 1970s rolled on, a golden age for American agriculture. The Russians were buying grain by the boatload, prices were sky high, and land values doubled, then doubled again. The government was telling farmers to plant fence row to fence row, and the banks were more than happy to lend them the money to do it. It was a fever, a gold rush played out in amber waves of grain. Frank Miller was the king of this new era. He bought the McGregor place, just as he'd boasted, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers in the county shake their heads in disbelief. To finance it, he'd taken out a variable-rate loan from Rich Vance's bank, but with corn at $3 a bushel and beans at $7, nobody was worried about interest rates. The next spring, a fleet of new equipment descended on the old McGregor farm. A brand-new John Deere 8640, an articulated four-wheel drive monster, ripped the earth with a 30-foot chisel plow. Behind it came a 24-row planter that could seed the entire farm in a week. Frank built massive new grain bins and a state-of-the-art machine shed that looked more like an airplane hangar. He drove a new Lincoln Continental, his wife wore a fur coat to church, and their kids went to college out of state. From every outward appearance, Frank Miller was a titan of industry, a visionary who had harnessed the power of debt and technology to build an empire. Jed watched it all from his own corner of the county. He had good years, too. The high grain prices meant his modest harvests brought in more money than he'd ever seen. But his reaction was different. While Frank was leveraging his profits into more land and more iron, Jed was banking his. He kept his expenses ruthlessly low. He bought his fertilizer in the fall, paying cash to get a discount. He did his own repairs, his own bookkeeping, his own marketing. He did allow himself one upgrade. He found an international 10 Nestesies at an estate sale. The tractor was only 5 years old, but the owner had passed away unexpectedly, and the family just wanted to settle the estate. It was a good, solid machine, famous for its powerful, turbocharged engine and its tough transmission. Jed inspected it for hours, checking the engine blow by, pulling fluid samples, and listening to the engine's every sound. He got it for a price that was almost theft, and he paid for it with a single check drawn on his savings account at the local credit union. His neighbors saw it as just another example of his backwardness. Frank Miller had just traded for a brand-new IH 1486 with the Deluxe red and white cab. Jed was buying his cast-offs. They'd see Jed out in the field on his open station 1066, eating dust, while they sat in their air-conditioned, stereo-equipped cabs, and they'd shake their heads. Poor old Jed just couldn't see the future. Even his own son, Tom, who was farming with him, started to get restless. "Dad," he'd say at the kitchen table, "Frank Miller's putting up another 2 grain bins. He's got a computer in his office that tells him when to sell. We're still using a pencil and a ledger book. We could afford to upgrade. We could buy that quarter section next to us that's coming up for sale." "We could," Jed would reply, never looking up from his plate. "But we're not going to borrow money to do it. If we can't pay cash, we wait." "Wait for what?" Tom would ask, his voice filled with the frustration of youth. "For the world to pass us by completely?" Jed would just take a sip of his coffee. "You wait for the weather to change, son. It always does." He was putting his money away, not in the stock market or speculative ventures, but in the safest places he could find. Certificates of deposit, U.S. savings bonds. He had accounts at 3 different banks, never keeping more than the federally insured limit in any one of them. To the bankers and the other farmers, he was a ghost, a non-entity. He wasn't a borrower. He wasn't a big-time player. He was just the quiet man in the old grain truck who paid his bills on time and never asked for a dime. They had no idea how much cash he was sitting on. A river of it, flowing silently and steadily into reservoirs of savings, waiting for the drought to come. One cool October evening in 1979, Jed was in his shed, cleaning the carburetor on his old Ford 8N utility tractor. The radio on the shelf was tuned to the farm report from a station in Des Moines. He was just finishing his work when the news came on. The announcer's voice was grim. He spoke of a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. He spoke of a war against inflation, a monster that was eating the country alive. And he spoke of the weapon Volcker was going to use: interest rates. The prime rate, the announcer said, had just been hiked to a shocking 15%. Jed stopped what he was doing, the tiny jet from the carburetor held in the jaws of his pliers. He stood perfectly still, listening. The announcer went on to say that economists were predicting rates could go even higher, perhaps to 20% or more. He talked about what this would mean for business loans, for home mortgages, and for farm operating notes. Outside, the wind began to pick up, rattling the tin sheets on the roof of the shed. A loose piece of flashing began to vibrate, making a low, mournful hum. Jed slowly put the carburetor part down on the clean rag on his workbench. He walked to the wide-open door of the shed and looked out across his fields of soybean stubble, silver in the fading light. The air felt heavy, charged. He could smell rain on the wind. He thought of Frank Miller's empire, built on a mountain of variable-rate loans. He thought of Rich Vance's gleaming dealership, filled with machines bought with borrowed money. He thought of all the farmers who had bet everything on the belief that the good times would last forever. A storm was coming, a financial hurricane the likes of which nobody had ever seen. And Jedediah Stone, the man they all called a relic, the man who farmed like it was 1955, knew he was standing on the only high ground in the whole county. He had a full woodshed, a cellar full of canned goods, and 0 debt. He was ready. The hum of the loose flashing on the shed roof was a discordant note in the symphony of the farm, a sound of something coming undone. For the next year, that sound was the soundtrack to Jedediah Stone's life. The news from the Des Moines station had not been an exaggeration. It was the first tremor of an earthquake that would shatter the foundations of American agriculture. The first real crack appeared not in a ledger book, but in the field. It was a wet spring, the kind that tests a farmer's patience, with only a few precious days between rains to get the corn in the ground. Frank Miller's operation was a sight to behold, his massive John Deere 8640 pulling a 24-row planter, covering ground at a speed that seemed impossible. Jed, on his International 1066 with a 12-row planter, felt like a rowboat in the wake of a battleship. Then, one afternoon, the battleship stopped. Jed was finishing a pass at the far end of his field, the one that bordered the old McGregor place, when he saw it. The big articulated Deere was sitting silent in the middle of a pass, its cab door ajar. Frank was on his knees beside one of the planter units, tools scattered in the mud around him. An hour later, as Jed was heading back to the shed for more seed, the tractor was still sitting there. Now, Rich Vance's gleaming service truck was parked beside it, a young mechanic in a clean uniform staring at the planter's complex hydraulic and pneumatic systems with a bewildered look on his face. Jed saw Frank the next day at the co-op. The usual bravado was gone, replaced by a weary frustration. His eyes were bloodshot. "Damn computers," Frank muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "The sensor on the number 17 row unit went out. Told the whole damn planter to shut down. Can you believe that? A 50-cent microchip has my $100,000 rig parked." "Can't you just bypass it?" another farmer asked. "That's the hell of it," Frank snapped. "It's all tied together. The mechanic says the part has to come from Moline. Be here in 2 days. 2 days. The forecast says rain for a week, starting tomorrow night." Jed just nodded a quiet greeting and went about his business. Later that day, the drive chain on his own planter snapped. It was an old number 50 roller chain, the kind you could find in any hardware store. He walked back to his shed, cut a new length from the roll he kept on a peg, and used his chain breaker to put it together. He was back planting within the hour. He finished his corn just as the first drops of that week-long rain began to fall. Frank Miller still had over 200 acres of mud. The financial storm hit harder and with less warning. The grain embargo against the Soviet Union slammed the lid on exports, and prices began a sickening slide. At the same time, those variable interest rates Frank and so many others had signed up for began their brutal, relentless climb. 16%, 18%, 20%. The numbers were abstract, but their effect was terrifyingly real. A loan payment that was manageable 1 month became impossible the next. The mood in the county soured. The easy confidence of the 70s curdled into a quiet, gnawing fear. The talk at the co-op was no longer about expansion and new equipment. It was about restructuring debt and holding on for 1 more year. Jed saw the change most clearly at the Agri-King dealership. He went in one day for an oil filter, and the place was a ghost town. The gleaming behemoths still sat on the polished floor, but now they were gathering a fine layer of dust. The salesmen, who used to buzz around customers like bees in a clover field, were clustered in Rich Vance's glass-walled office, their faces grim. Rich himself looked thinner, the perfect hair somehow less perfect, the smile completely gone. He was on the phone, his voice tight and strained. Jed could hear bits of the conversation. An extension. Floor plan. Just need a little more time. The temple of modern agriculture had become a tomb. The machines that were supposed to represent the future now looked like extravagant monuments to a foolish dream. Rich saw Jed at the parts counter, and for the first time, there was no smirk, no condescending joke. He just gave a curt, empty nod and turned back to his phone call, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The leverage he had so proudly preached about had become a hangman's noose. For Jed, life went on. The low prices hurt, but they didn't cripple him. His operating costs were a fraction of his neighbors. He didn't have a $4,000 a month payment on a tractor or a $10,000 note on a land purchase. His biggest expense was property tax, and he'd set that money aside the previous fall, as he always did. One evening, his son Tom came into the kitchen, tossing the county newspaper onto the table. His face was pale. "Dad, look at this." Jed picked up the paper. It was folded to the legal notices. His eyes scanned the columns of dense black type. Foreclosure sales. There were 2 at first, then 5, then a dozen. Farms that had been in the same family for 100 years, now reduced to a block of text and an auction date. He saw the Miller name. Not the McGregor place. Not yet. It was for 160 acres on the home farm, the piece Frank's grandfather had homesteaded. "He's losing it," Tom said, his voice a whisper. "He's losing it all." Jed folded the paper carefully and set it aside. He looked out the window at the setting sun, which painted the clouds in brilliant, bloody strokes of orange and red. "When a fire goes through the prairie," Jed said softly, "it burns hottest where the grass is thickest. It burns itself out on the places that were already lean." He turned to his son, his eyes clear and steady. "We're going to be all right, son. We just have to stand still and let the fire pass." The fire did not pass. It became an inferno. By 1982, the farm crisis was a national catastrophe. The prime rate had peaked at an unbelievable 21.5%. Land values, which had been the collateral for the mountain of debt, collapsed. Land that had sold for $3,000 an acre was now lucky to bring $800. Farmers who were millionaires on paper 2 years earlier were suddenly bankrupt. The foreclosure notices in the paper became a weekly roll call of the damned. Frank Miller's name appeared again and again. First the McGregor place, the crown jewel of his empire, then the rest of his land, then the new grain bins, the machine shed. The bank was taking everything. One afternoon, Jed was driving his old Chevy grain truck home when he saw Frank's Lincoln Continental pulled over on the side of the road. Frank was just sitting inside, staring straight ahead at the fields he no longer owned. Jed had never seen a man look so completely broken. The titan of agriculture had been reduced to a ghost, haunting the edges of his former kingdom. The final, inevitable notice appeared a month later. A complete liquidation auction. Everything was to be sold. All the new, magnificent machinery. All the tools. Everything. Right down to the fuel barrels and the office furniture. The date was set for a Saturday in early April. Jed spent the week before the auction in a state of quiet activity. He made 2 trips to the county seat. The first was to the credit union, where he met with the president in his small office. The second was to the larger commercial bank downtown. He spoke with managers, signed papers, and made arrangements. When he was done, he had a series of certified cashier's checks folded neatly in the inside pocket of his denim jacket. The morning of the auction was cold and grey, a raw wind whipping across the muddy farmyard. It felt like a funeral. Half the county was there, not with the excited buzz of a typical farm sale, but with a somber, morbid curiosity. They walked among the rows of machinery, their hands in their pockets, their voices low. The equipment was immaculate. The John Deere 8640 and the International 1586 were parked side by side, their paint still shining. The axial flow combine, with its massive grain head, looked big enough to swallow a house. It was a fleet built for a general, now being sold off to pay for a lost war. Frank Miller stood near the farmhouse with his wife, looking like strangers at their own wake. He was gaunt, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame. Rich Vance was there too, standing alone at the edge of the crowd. His dealership had folded 2 months prior. The bank had called his floor plan loan, and he couldn't make the payment. The gleaming Temple of Progress was now a vacant building with a for sale sign out front. Rich's face was a mask of bitter irony, watching the very machines he'd sold with such arrogant confidence go under the hammer. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a microphone wired to speakers on his truck, started with the small items: wrenches, tool chests, spare parts. The bidding was sluggish. No one had any money. Then he moved to the main line. "All right, folks, here's what you came for," he boomed, his voice artificially cheerful. "We're going to start with this beautiful International 1586 tractor. Barely 1,500 hours on it. Who will start the bidding at $50,000? Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the shed. $50,000, gentlemen. This is a $120,000 tractor. $40,000. Who'll give me 40? A lone hand went up. A farmer from the next county. 20, he said. The auctioneer's face fell. 20,000. Sir, the tires are worth almost that much. He worked for another 5 minutes, but the bidding stalled out at $23,000. It was a fraction of what the bank was owed on it. Next was the massive 80 licit 40. The result was the same. The bidding was pitiful, topping out at $35,000 for a machine that had cost Frank nearly $150,000 just a few years before. Frank turned away, unable to watch. Jedediah Stone had been standing at the back of the crowd, near his old grain truck, watching everything without expression. Tom stood beside him, shifting his weight nervously. "Dad, this is a slaughter," he whispered. Jed didn't answer. He just watched as the auctioneer, looking desperate, moved to the combine. The bids were even lower. The machine was too big, too specialized. No one could afford to run it, let alone buy it. The auctioneer stopped, wiping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cold. "Folks, we can't give this equipment away. The bank representative is here. We have to do better." He looked out at the sea of grim faces. "Let's try something different. Let's lot the big items together. The 8640, the 1586, the combine, the 24-row planter, and the 30-foot chisel plow. The whole late-model tillage and harvest line. One money." He paused, letting the idea sink in. "It's the heart of a modern farming operation, gentlemen. Who'll start me at $100,000 for the whole package?" The silence was absolute. $100,000 might as well have been $1 million. It was more cash than anyone in the county had seen in years. The auctioneer was about to give up, to move on, when a calm, steady voice came from the back of the crowd. "I will." Every head turned. It was Jedediah Stone. He hadn't moved, hadn't raised a hand. He just spoke, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. He was wearing his usual stained overalls and a worn-out seed corn cap. The auctioneer squinted. "Did you say you'd bid 100,000, Jed?" "No," Jed said, taking a slow step forward. The crowd parted for him, like the Red Sea. "I'll bid 200,000. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $200,000. In cash, it was an impossible number. Rich Vance stared, his mouth hanging open. Frank Miller turned around, his eyes wide with disbelief. 200,000, the auctioneer bellowed, his energy suddenly returning. "I have 200. Who'll give me 210? 210,000. He looked around, but there was no one. The other farmers just stared at Jed, their expressions a mixture of awe and confusion. This was the man they had dismissed as a relic, a stubborn old fool. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, slamming his hand down on the fender of the tractor. "For $200,000 to Jedediah Stone." But Jed wasn't finished. He walked right up to the auctioneer's truck. "Let's not waste any more time," he said, his voice quiet but firm, for the auctioneer alone. The grain trucks, the gravity wagons, the rest of the tillage equipment. Another $150,000 for all of it. The auctioneer's eyes nearly popped out of his head. He knew a lifeline when he saw one. He got back on the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a buyer for the remainder of the machinery line." By the time he was done an hour later, Jedediah Stone had bought nearly every significant piece of equipment on the farm. The final tally was just over $400,000 for a line of machinery whose original purchase price was well over $900,000. He had single-handedly saved the auction from being a complete disaster for the bank. He walked to the clerk's table set up in the driveway. He calmly took the folded checks from his jacket pocket and laid them out. They were all certified. The money was real. As the clerk frantically scribbled out a receipt, the other farmers just watched him, their perceptions of the man in the dirty overalls being completely, irrevocably rewritten. He wasn't a relic. He was a king, quietly surveying a kingdom he had just bought for pennies on the dollar. After the crowd had dispersed and the auctioneer had packed up, Jed found Frank Miller sitting on the steps of the house he would have to vacate by the end of the month. His wife was inside, packing boxes. Frank didn't look up as Jed approached. Jed stood there for a moment, the bill of sale in his hand. He wasn't there to gloat. That wasn't his way. "Frank," he said. Frank looked up, his eyes empty. "Come to rub it in, Jed. Come to tell me you told me so." "No," Jed said, shaking his head. "I came to offer you a job. I just bought more iron than I know what to do with. All those computers and sensors. That's not my world, but it's yours. And I just bought the McGregor place back from the bank, too. I'm going to need someone to run it. Someone who knows that ground and that equipment better than anyone." Frank stared at him, speechless. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Tears welled in his eyes, the first crack in the dam of his pride. "Why, Jed? After everything I said, all the times I made fun of you." "Because this is a hard business, Frank," Jed said. "And it's a lonely one. No man should have to go through it alone. And besides," he added, a rare, small smile touching his lips, "you're the only one who knows how to fix that damn planter when the sensor on number 17 goes out." In the years that followed, the farm crisis slowly receded. Prices stabilized, interest rates fell, and a fragile sense of normalcy returned to the heartland. But the landscape was forever changed. Half the farms in the county were gone, bought up by corporations or the few survivors like Jedediah Stone. The Stone family farm became one of the largest and most successful operations in the state. Tom took over the day-to-day management, using the modern equipment with an efficiency his father had never dreamed of, but he did it using his father's principles. They never borrowed a dime they didn't have to. They paid cash. They kept their costs low. Frank Miller stayed on as their farm manager for 20 years, a quiet, humbled, and deeply loyal man. He and Jed became unlikely friends, bonded by the shared memory of the fire. One warm summer evening, many years later, Jed, now an old man, with hands gnarled by a lifetime of work, walked with his grandson through the massive machine shed. The boy, who was about 10, looked up in awe at the rows of huge green and red machines, all clean, all maintained, all paid for. But in the place of honor, at the front of the shed, sat two older tractors. One was the John Deere 420, its green paint restored to a deep luster. The other was the International 1066. They weren't used much anymore, but Jed started them both every week. "Grandpa," the boy asked, "why do we keep these old ones? They're so small." Jed stopped and placed a hand on the warm fender of the 420. He looked at his grandson, his eyes full of a wisdom that had been earned through drought and flood, through boom and bust. "We keep them," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. To remember that it's not the size of the tractor that makes a farmer. It's the size of his savings account. It's not about how fast you can go, but how long you can last. These machines, he said, patting the fender, they don't have computers, they don't have air conditioning, but they have a story. They taught me that you don't build a farm on debt and hope. You build it on dirt and sweat and the cash you've got in your pocket. Never forget that. The boy nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the deep truth in his grandfather's words. Jed smiled and looked out the open door of the shed, across the endless fields of corn and soybeans stretching out to the horizon. The land was his. Not because a bank said so, but because his name was on the deed, free and clear. The man in the dirty overalls had played the long game, and in the end he had won it all.